Marcus Wellington had always believed that money could buy him anything, including respect. Standing at the ornate gates of Buckingham Palace on a crisp London morning, he adjusted his expensive Armani suit and checked his gold Rolex for the third time in 5 minutes. The 42-year-old real estate mogul from Dallas had flown to London first class, stayed in the most expensive suite at the Ritz, and now expected the same level of special treatment he received everywhere else. The morning sun cast long shadows across the forecourt as tourists gathered behind the designated barriers, cameras ready to capture the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Children pressed their faces against the railings, eyes wide with wonder, while parents explained the significance of the red-coated soldiers who stood motionless at their posts. The atmosphere buzzed with excitement and reverence for the centuries-old tradition they were about to witness. Marcus, however, felt no such reverence. To him, these uniformed men were merely costumed performers, no different from the street entertainers he'd seen near Covent Garden the night before. He had paid good money for this vacation, and he intended to get his money's worth, even if it meant bending a few rules. The Coldstream Guards stood at attention, their scarlet tunics immaculate, their bearskin hats perfectly positioned. Among them was Guardsman James Morrison, a 24-year-old from Manchester who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the prestigious unit. James understood the weight of tradition he carried on his shoulders. Every morning, he polished his brass buttons until they gleamed, knowing that he represented not just himself, but centuries of British military heritage. As the ceremony preparation began, tourists instinctively moved back, creating a respectful distance. The palace staff had strategically placed barriers and signs in multiple languages, clearly marking where visitors should stand. Most people complied willingly, understanding that they were guests witnessing something sacred to British culture. But Marcus had other plans. He noticed that from his position behind the barrier, his expensive camera couldn't capture the perfect shot he wanted for his social media followers back home. In his mind, he had traveled too far and paid too much to settle for mediocre photographs. After all, wasn't the customer always right? Wasn't he entitled to the best possible experience for his investment? Without hesitation, Marcus stepped over the rope barrier. The moment his designer Italian leather shoes touched the forbidden ground, several things happened simultaneously. Palace security officers began moving in his direction, tourists gasped and pointed, and, most importantly, the disciplined guards maintained their positions despite the obvious disturbance. "Sir, you need to return behind the barrier immediately," called out a security officer, her voice firm but professional. She was Sarah Chen, a 5-year veteran of palace security who had dealt with countless incidents involving overeager tourists. Her training had taught her to de-escalate situations quickly and quietly, minimizing disruption to both the ceremony and other visitors. Marcus barely glanced in her direction. "I'm just taking a quick photo," he said dismissively, raising his camera toward the nearest guard. "This will only take a second." But it wouldn't take just a second. As Marcus moved closer to the stationary guard, completely ignoring the security officer's repeated requests to return to the designated area, other tourists began to voice their disapproval. An elderly British gentleman shook his head in disgust, while a family from Japan looked on in embarrassment for the American tourist who was making such a spectacle of himself. "Please, sir, these are working soldiers," Sarah Chen continued, now positioning herself between Marcus and the guard. "They're not here for photo opportunities. You're interfering with a military operation." Marcus laughed, a sound that carried across the courtyard and made several people wince. "Military operation? They're just standing there in funny costumes. Relax, sweetheart. I know what I'm doing." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, and it sparked something in the crowd. These weren't just random people in costumes, as Marcus so casually dismissed them. These were soldiers who had sworn an oath to protect the crown and had proven their worth in some of the world's most dangerous places. The disrespect was palpable, and it began to anger even the most patient observers. Guardsman Morrison, though maintaining his rigid posture, felt every muscle in his body tense. He had stood guard in Helmand Province, where a moment's lapse in attention could mean death for himself and his comrades. He had lost friends to roadside bombs and sniper fire. Now, back home, he was supposed to endure insults from a tourist who viewed his service as entertainment. The ceremony was meant to begin in 15 minutes, and Marcus showed no signs of backing down. If anything, he seemed to be enjoying the attention his defiance was generating. He took several more steps toward the guard, ignoring the increasingly urgent commands from security personnel. "This is your final warning, sir," Sarah Chin announced, her hand now resting on her radio. "Move back behind the barrier or you will be removed from the premises." Marcus turned to face her fully for the first time, his expression one of amused superiority. "Do you know who I am? I own more property than this entire palace is worth. I've donated more money to charity than you'll make in a lifetime. I'm not some common tourist you can push around." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Around the courtyard, phones began appearing as other tourists started recording the confrontation. What had begun as a simple matter of crowd control was escalating into something much more significant. An 8-year-old girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Why is that man being mean to the soldier, Mummy?" she whispered in a clear, carrying voice that somehow seemed louder than Marcus's boasts. Her mother, a teacher from Leeds, knelt down to her daughter's level but spoke loudly enough for others to hear. "Some people think money makes them more important than everyone else, sweetheart. But it doesn't. Respect isn't something you can buy." The simple wisdom of the explanation resonated through the crowd, and Marcus felt the collective judgment of dozens of strangers settling on his shoulders. But, instead of reconsidering his behavior, he doubled down. "Look, I've come a long way for this," he announced to anyone within earshot. "I'm not leaving without getting the shots I want. These guards are paid to stand here and look pretty for tourists like me. That's their job." It was then that something shifted in Guardsman Morrison's demeanor. Though he couldn't move or speak while on duty, his breathing changed slightly. His jaw tightened imperceptibly. The insult to his profession and his comrades cut deeper than any physical wound he'd received in combat. Sarah Chen made a decision. She activated her radio and called for additional security support. "Control, this is Chen at the main gate. We have a code yellow situation with an uncooperative tourist. Request immediate backup and prepare for possible ejection protocol." The response was immediate. Within minutes, 4 additional security officers emerged from various points around the palace grounds, moving with practiced efficiency toward the confrontation. Their presence created a subtle but unmistakable circle around Marcus, who suddenly found himself surrounded. "Gentlemen," Marcus addressed the new arrivals with the same casual arrogance he'd shown throughout the encounter, "surely we can resolve this like civilized people. I'm willing to make a donation to whatever charity the palace supports. Let's say £10,000 for 5 minutes of photo time?" The offer hung in the air, and, for a moment, the crowd fell silent. Some visitors looked shocked at the casual way he threw around such a large sum, while others appeared disgusted by his assumption that everything and everyone had a price. But the security officers weren't interested in negotiations. Their job wasn't to broker deals with entitled tourists, it was to protect the dignity and integrity of the institution they served. "Sir, you will move behind the barrier now, or you will be escorted from the premises," the lead officer stated clearly. "There will be no further warnings." Marcus looked around at the faces surrounding him. For the first time since arriving in London, he saw something he wasn't accustomed to seeing: people who weren't impressed by his wealth or status. These individuals, from the security officers to the tourists to the guards themselves, operated according to principles that money couldn't purchase. The realization should have been humbling, but Marcus had spent too many years believing in his own superiority to back down now. Instead, he made a decision that would change the trajectory of his entire trip to London. "Fine," he said with exaggerated patience. "If you won't let me take photos from here, I'll just get closer to the guard. Maybe he'll be more reasonable than you people." With that announcement, Marcus began walking directly toward Guardsman Morrison, his camera raised and ready. The crowd gasped, security officers moved to intercept him, and, somewhere in the distance, a police whistle began to blow. The confrontation had reached its boiling point, and Marcus Wellington was about to learn that there were some lines that money, arrogance, and entitlements simply couldn't cross. The ancient stones of Buckingham Palace had witnessed many dramatic moments throughout history, but this morning's events would become a story that tourists would share for years to come. As Marcus closed the distance between himself and the motionless guard, he had no idea that he was about to experience the most humbling moment of his privileged life. The wheels of consequence were already in motion, and no amount of money or bluster would be able to stop them. The morning sun continued to shine down on the palace courtyard, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. What had begun as a peaceful gathering of tourists eager to witness a time-honored ceremony had transformed into a tense standoff between entitlement and duty, between commerce and honor, between one man's arrogance and centuries of tradition. And, at the center of it all stood Guardsman Morrison, silent and motionless, carrying the weight of his oath and the dignity of his uniform, waiting to see how far one foolish tourist was willing to push before learning that some boundaries were absolute. As Marcus approached the immobile guard, the atmosphere in the courtyard became electric with tension. Every tourist, every security officer, and every palace staff member held their breath, waiting to see what would happen when an unstoppable force of entitlement met the immovable object of military discipline. Guardsman Morrison could see Marcus approaching in his peripheral vision, but his training kept him focused straight ahead. 3 years of military service, including combat deployments, had taught him that discipline wasn't just about following orders, it was about maintaining composure when chaos erupted around you. His rifle, though ceremonial, remained perfectly positioned. His breathing stayed controlled. His expression never changed. But, inside, Morrison was fighting a battle that Marcus couldn't see or understand. Every step the tourist took toward him was a step closer to violating everything Morrison held sacred about his duty. The young soldier thought about his grandfather, who had served in the same regiment during World War II. He thought about his fallen comrades from Afghanistan, who would never again have the honor of standing guard at the palace. And he thought about the oath he had taken to serve with honor, regardless of the circumstances. Marcus, meanwhile, was operating under a completely different set of assumptions. In his world of corporate mergers and real estate deals, aggression and persistence usually paid off. People backed down when you showed them you weren't intimidated. Rules were guidelines that could be negotiated around if you had enough leverage. He had built his fortune by pushing boundaries and refusing to take no for an answer. "Look, soldier," Marcus said as he came within arm's reach of Morrison, his voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. "I'm not trying to cause trouble here. I just want a good photo to show my friends back home. How about we make a deal? I'll slip you £100, and you just turn your head slightly toward my camera. Nobody gets hurt, everybody wins." The offer was so fundamentally misguided that several people in the crowd gasped audibly. An elderly veteran wearing a British Legion pin stepped forward slightly, his face red with indignation. A young mother covered her child's ears, not wanting him to hear such disrespectful language directed at a soldier. Morrison's jaw muscles tightened almost imperceptibly, but he remained silent and motionless. The insult wasn't just personal, it was an attack on the integrity of every guard who had ever stood at this post. The idea that he could be bought, that his honor was for sale, cut deeper than any criticism of his appearance or his profession. Sarah Chen, the lead security officer, was now speaking rapidly into her radio. "Control, we have a tourist attempting to bribe a guard and refusing multiple orders to return to the designated area. Request immediate assistance from the Met Police. This situation is escalating beyond our protocols." The response was swift and decisive. Within minutes, 2 Metropolitan Police constables appeared at the palace gates, their presence immediately noticed by the growing crowd of onlookers. The situation had officially moved beyond a simple tourist management issue and into the realm of potential criminal behavior. But Marcus seemed oblivious to the escalating consequences of his actions. Instead of stepping back when he saw the police approaching, he doubled down on his confrontational approach. "Officer Morrison," he said, reading the name tag on the guard's uniform, "I can see you're a professional. You understand how business works. I'm offering you an opportunity here. One quick photo, a little compensation for your trouble, and we can all move on with our day." The use of his name seemed to particularly upset the tourists who were watching. They understood, even if Marcus didn't, that this was a real person with a real military record, not a prop in a tourist attraction. A teenage girl from Birmingham turned to her friends and said in a disgusted whisper, "He's treating him like he's not even human." It was at that moment that Police Constable Williams reached the scene. A 15-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police, Williams had dealt with every type of difficult tourist London could produce, from drunk football fans to aggressive street performers to confused visitors who didn't understand local laws. But something about Marcus's behavior struck him as particularly problematic. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the guard immediately and return to the designated tourist area," Constable Williams announced in a clear, authoritative voice that carried across the courtyard. Marcus turned to face the policeman with the same dismissive attitude he'd shown everyone else. "Officer, I appreciate you doing your job, but this is really just a misunderstanding. I'm an American citizen, and I have rights here. I'm not doing anything illegal, I'm just trying to take a photograph." "Actually, sir, you're doing several things that violate local ordinances," Williams replied patiently. "You're trespassing on restricted palace grounds, you're interfering with a military ceremony, you've ignored multiple lawful orders from security personnel, and you've attempted to bribe a member of Her Majesty's forces. Any one of those could result in your arrest." For the first time since the confrontation began, Marcus seemed to register that he might actually face real consequences for his behavior. But, instead of backing down gracefully, he fell back on the strategy that had always worked for him in the past, escalating the stakes. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" he demanded, his voice rising to a level that could be heard clearly throughout the courtyard. "I own Wellington Development Corporation. I have friends in high places. I play golf with senators and congressmen. I can make one phone call and have your job if you don't start treating me with the respect I deserve." The threat hung in the air like a noxious cloud. Around the courtyard, tourists looked at each other in amazement and disgust. They had come to witness a ceremony celebrating tradition, honor, and service, and instead they were watching one man's spectacular display of arrogance and entitlement. Constable Williams, however, was unimpressed by the threats. He had dealt with wealthy, connected individuals before, and he knew that his duty remained the same regardless of someone's social status or financial resources. "Sir, I don't care if you play golf with the Prime Minister himself," Williams said firmly. "You're currently violating British law on British soil, and my job is to enforce that law equally for everyone, regardless of their background or connections." It was then that Marcus made perhaps the most foolish decision of his entire life. Instead of accepting the officer's authority and backing down, he decided to test just how far his American privilege and wealth could take him in a foreign country. "Fine," he announced dramatically. "If you won't let me take my photo from here, I'll just touch the guard's uniform. That should make for an interesting picture." Before anyone could react, Marcus reached out his hand toward Guardsman Morrison's immaculate red tunic. The movement was quick and deliberate, clearly intended to make contact with the soldier despite all the warnings he had received. But Guardsman Morrison was ready. Years of military training had prepared him for threats both foreign and domestic. His reflexes, honed by combat experience and countless hours of drill, kicked in automatically. Without breaking his rigid posture or changing his facial expression, Morrison smoothly sidestepped Marcus's reaching hand while simultaneously bringing the butt of his ceremonial rifle around in a precisely controlled arc. The movement was so fluid and professional that it looked almost choreographed. Morrison never broke his military bearing, never showed anger or frustration, and never used more force than absolutely necessary. But the result was immediate and unmistakable. Marcus found himself sprawled on the ancient cobblestones of the palace courtyard, his expensive suit rumpled and his dignity in tatters. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. Tourists who had been watching in horrified fascination at Marcus's behavior suddenly found themselves cheering for the guard who had defended himself with such skill and restraint. Children clapped excitedly, while their parents captured the moment on their phones, already planning to share the video with friends and family back home. Marcus lay on the ground for several seconds, too stunned to move. In all his years of aggressive business tactics and entitled behavior, no one had ever actually stood up to him physically. He was used to people backing down, used to getting his way through intimidation and financial pressure. The reality of being outmaneuvered by someone he had dismissed as a costumed performer was almost too much for his ego to process. As he struggled to get back to his feet, Marcus noticed that his expensive camera had also hit the ground and was now sporting a long crack across its LCD screen. The device that was supposed to capture his triumph over British protocol had instead become a casualty of his own hubris. "That's assault!" Marcus shouted as he brushed dirt off his suit. "I want that soldier arrested. This is completely unacceptable." But Constable Williams was already shaking his head. "Actually, sir, what you just witnessed was a textbook example of defensive action by a member of the military. Guardsman Morrison was well within his rights to defend himself when you attempted to make unwanted physical contact. If anyone's committed assault here, it's you." The legal reality of his situation was beginning to dawn on Marcus, but his pride wouldn't let him accept defeat gracefully. Around him, the crowd of tourists was growing larger as word spread about the confrontation. People who had been visiting other parts of the palace grounds were hurrying over to see what was happening, and many were capturing the scene on their phones and cameras. Marcus realized that his humiliating encounter was being recorded from multiple angles and would likely end up on social media platforms around the world. The thought of his business associates, his country club friends, and his social media followers seeing him sprawled on the ground outside Buckingham Palace made his face burn with embarrassment and rage. "This isn't over," he declared, pointing an accusatory finger at both the guard and the police officer. "I'm going to file complaints with everyone I can think of. The American Embassy, the British Tourism Board, my travel agent, everyone. You people have no idea what you've just done." But, as Marcus continued his threats and denials, the situation was evolving beyond his control. More police officers were arriving on the scene, palace security had begun cordoning off the area to minimize disruption to other tourists, and, somewhere in the administrative offices of Buckingham Palace, official incident reports were already being prepared. The most humbling realization was yet to come for Marcus Wellington, but the foundation had already been laid. His assumption that money and status would protect him from consequences was about to be thoroughly tested by the British legal system, and the results would be far more educational than any tourist attraction he had planned to visit. The aftermath of Marcus's encounter with Guardsman Morrison unfolded with the systematic precision that characterized all official British procedures. Within minutes of his undignified sprawl across the palace courtyard, Marcus found himself surrounded by a carefully coordinated response that demonstrated just how seriously the authorities took breaches of royal protocol. Detective Inspector Patricia Hayes arrived on the scene as Marcus was still brushing dust from his designer suit and nursing his wounded pride. A 20-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police with extensive experience in diplomatic and royal security matters, Hayes had seen her share of entitled tourists who believed their wealth exempted them from local laws. But Marcus's behavior struck her as particularly egregious, not just for its flagrant disregard of protocol, but for the calculated way he had attempted to humiliate a serving soldier. "Mr. Wellington," Hayes addressed him formally, having already received his identification details from the responding officers. "I'm Detective Inspector Hayes. I need to inform you that you're being detained under the Public Order Act for behavior likely to cause harassment, alarm, or distress, and under the Criminal Justice Act for trespassing on restricted government property." Marcus's face flushed red with indignation. "This is ridiculous. I'm an American citizen. You can't arrest me for taking photographs." His voice carried across the courtyard, causing more tourists to turn and stare at the unfolding drama. "Actually, sir, we can and we are," Hayes replied calmly. "You're not being arrested for photography. You're being arrested for repeatedly ignoring lawful orders to vacate restricted areas, for attempting to interfere with military personnel performing their duties, and for attempting to bribe a member of Her Majesty's forces. These are serious offenses under British law." As the formal caution was read to him, Marcus looked around desperately for support or sympathy from the crowd of onlookers. Instead, he found faces filled with disgust, disappointment, and, in some cases, outright hostility. The tourists who had come to witness the majesty of British tradition had instead been treated to a display of American arrogance that embarrassed everyone involved. An elderly British gentleman wearing military medals stepped forward slightly. 30 years I served this country," he said in a voice loud enough for Marcus to hear. "And I've never seen such disrespectful behavior toward one of our lads. Shameful, absolutely shameful." His words seemed to resonate through the crowd, and several other observers nodded in agreement. A family from Australia, who had been looking forward to the ceremony as a highlight of their European vacation, gathered their children closer and began explaining why it was so important to respect the traditions and laws of the countries you visit. Meanwhile, Guardsman Morrison had seamlessly returned to his position of attention, showing no outward sign that anything unusual had occurred. His professionalism in handling the situation had earned him quiet nods of approval from the other guards and admiring glances from the tourists who understood what they had witnessed. For Morrison, protecting the dignity of his post was simply part of the job, no different from any other duty he might be called upon to perform. As Marcus was led away by the police officers, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking against the ancient cobblestones, he continued to voice his outrage and disbelief. "This is going to cost your country millions in lost tourism revenue," he shouted over his shoulder. "I have friends who were planning to visit London. They'll hear about this treatment." Detective Inspector Hayes, walking beside him, couldn't help but respond to his threats. "Sir, I think you'll find that most tourists actually appreciate a country that maintains order and respects its institutions. The kind of visitor who would be put off by seeing law enforcement do their job properly probably isn't the kind of tourist we're hoping to attract anyway." The journey to the waiting police vehicle became something of a gauntlet for Marcus as more tourists realized what was happening. Phones appeared throughout the crowd as people began recording the arrest of the man who had tried to humiliate a British soldier. The videos would later appear on social media platforms around the world, turning Marcus's moment of personal entitlement into an international symbol of tourist behavior gone wrong. At the police station, Marcus's situation became even more complicated. The duty sergeant, a no-nonsense woman named Collins who had processed thousands of arrests during her career, was unmoved by Marcus's continued protests about his wealth and connections. "Mr. Wellington," she said as she began the formal booking process, "you'll have the opportunity to make a phone call once we've completed the intake procedures. In the meantime, I need to inform you that attempting to bribe a military officer is a serious offense that could result in up to 6 months in prison and a substantial fine." For the first time since the confrontation began, Marcus seemed to grasp that he might be facing real consequences. The possibility of spending time in a British jail, of having a criminal record that could affect his business operations and international travel, began to sink in. "Look, I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his tone noticeably less aggressive than it had been at the palace. "I wasn't trying to bribe anyone. I was just offering to make a donation to whatever charity the palace supports. It's a common practice in America." Sergeant Collins raised an eyebrow. "Sir, offering money to a soldier in exchange for them breaking protocol is the definition of bribery, regardless of how you choose to phrase it. The fact that you may have done similar things in other countries doesn't make it legal here." The booking process continued with methodical efficiency. Marcus's personal effects were catalogued and stored, his fingerprints were taken, and his photograph was added to the police database. Each step of the procedure drove home the reality that his wealth and status meant nothing in this institutional setting. While Marcus sat in a holding cell, contemplating the collapse of what was supposed to be a triumphant vacation, news of his arrest was already beginning to spread beyond London. The videos recorded by tourists at Buckingham Palace were being shared across social media platforms, generating thousands of comments from viewers around the world. Back at his hotel, Marcus's absence was noted by the concierge who had been expecting him to return for an expensive lunch reservation. The same staff members who had been treating him with deference due to his expensive suite and generous tips would soon learn about his arrest from the evening news broadcasts. In his executive suite, Marcus's laptop remained open to his company's website, where his biography proudly proclaimed his success in navigating complex international business environments and his reputation for achieving results in challenging situations. The irony of his current predicament would not be lost on his business associates when news of the arrest inevitably reached them. Meanwhile, Detective Inspector Hayes was preparing the formal charges against Marcus. Her report would detail not just the immediate infractions, but the pattern of escalating disrespect and entitlement that had led to the confrontation. The case would serve as a clear example of how British authorities dealt with tourists who believed their financial resources exempted them from local laws and customs. The American Embassy in London received notification of Marcus's arrest as part of standard diplomatic protocols. A junior consular officer was assigned to monitor the case, but there was little they could do beyond ensuring Marcus received fair treatment under British law. His wealthy connections and political friends back home held no sway in the British legal system. As evening approached, Marcus found himself facing a choice that would define the rest of his London experience. He could continue to fight the charges, insisting on his innocence and demanding special treatment, which would likely result in extended legal proceedings and maximum penalties. Alternatively, he could accept responsibility for his actions and hope for leniency from the courts. The decision would reveal whether Marcus had learned anything from his humbling encounter with British justice, or whether his arrogance ran too deep to be corrected by a single day in police custody. Either way, his story was already becoming a cautionary tale that would be shared among tourists for years to come. The ancient traditions of Buckingham Palace had survived another challenge, protected by the same principles of duty, honor, and respect that had sustained them for centuries. And, somewhere in the palace barracks, Guardsman Morrison was writing his own report of the day's events, capturing in simple, factual language the moment when British discipline met American entitlement and emerged victorious. The confrontation that Marcus had thought would be a minor inconvenience on his expensive vacation had instead become the defining moment of his trip to London, though not in the way he had ever imagined. The next morning brought Marcus Wellington face to face with the full weight of the British legal system. Westminster Magistrates' Court, with its imposing Victorian architecture and centuries of legal tradition, provided a sobering backdrop for what Marcus had assumed would be a simple formality to clear up the misunderstanding from the previous day. District Judge Eleanor Ashworth presided over the morning session with the same dignified authority that characterized everything about the British judicial system. A Cambridge-educated barrister with 30 years of experience, Judge Ashworth had seen countless cases involving tourists who had overstepped legal boundaries, but Marcus's case struck her as particularly noteworthy for the defendant's apparent inability to comprehend the seriousness of his actions. Marcus had spent the night in police custody, his requests for special accommodation denied despite his offers to pay for upgraded facilities. The same cell that housed drunk teenagers and petty criminals had been his home for 12 hours, providing him with ample time to consider how dramatically his London vacation had deteriorated. His expensive suit, now rumpled and stained from his encounter with the palace courtyard, made him look more like a disheveled businessman than the powerful executive he claimed to be. The contrast between his current appearance and his usual image of success was not lost on the court reporter, who noted Marcus's diminished bearing in her official record. Standing before Judge Ashworth, Marcus was represented by a duty solicitor named David Pembroke, a competent but overworked public defender who had been assigned to the case due to Marcus's inability to secure private representation on such short notice. Pembroke had reviewed the police reports and witness statements, and his professional opinion was clear: Marcus was facing serious charges with substantial evidence against him. Mr. Wellington, Judge Ashworth began, her voice carrying the authority of both her position and the institution she represented, you stand accused of several serious offenses committed yesterday at Buckingham Palace. These charges include trespassing on restricted government property, interfering with military personnel in the performance of their duties, attempting to bribe a member of Her Majesty's forces, and conduct likely to cause harassment, alarm, or distress to members of the public. The formal reading of the charges seemed to physically diminish Marcus. Each accusation represented not just a legal violation, but a fundamental misunderstanding of the society he had visited. His assumption that wealth could override law, that American citizenship provided immunity from local consequences, and that British traditions were merely tourist attractions had been systematically dismantled by the events of the previous day. How do you plead to these charges? Judge Ashworth asked, her pen poised to record his response. Marcus's duty solicitor had advised him to plead guilty and throw himself on the mercy of the court, explaining that fighting the charges would likely result in harsher penalties given the overwhelming evidence against him. But Marcus's pride, even after a night in custody, struggled against admitting fault. Your Honor, Marcus began, his voice lacking the confident bluster he had displayed at the palace, I believe there's been a misunderstanding about my intentions. I'm a successful businessman from Texas, and I was simply trying to take photographs during my vacation. I never meant to offend anyone or break any laws. Judge Ashworth's expression remained impassive. Mr. Wellington, the court is not concerned with your business success or your nationality. We are here to address your actions yesterday, which were witnessed by dozens of tourists, recorded by multiple cameras, and documented by several police officers. The evidence suggests that you repeatedly ignored lawful orders from security personnel and attempted to bribe a serving soldier. How do you plead? The moment of decision had arrived. Marcus could continue to protest his innocence and face the full consequences of his actions, or he could accept responsibility and hope for judicial mercy. After a long pause that seemed to stretch across the silent courtroom, Marcus made his choice. "Guilty, Your Honor," he said quietly, the words barely audible even in the hushed chamber. The admission seemed to release a tension that had been building since his arrest. For the first time since arriving in London, Marcus was acknowledging that his behavior had been wrong, that his actions had consequences, and that his wealth could not protect him from accountability. Judge Ashworth nodded and made notes in the court record. "Mr. Wellington, before I pass sentence, I want to ensure you understand the seriousness of your offenses. Buckingham Palace is not merely a tourist attraction, it is the working headquarters of the British monarchy and home to serving military personnel who have dedicated their lives to protecting our institutions. Your attempt to bribe Guardsman Morrison was not just illegal, it was an insult to every man and woman who has served this country with honor." The judge's words carried a weight that seemed to settle heavily on Marcus's shoulders. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, he was being held accountable by someone who could not be influenced by his wealth or connections. "The court has reviewed the evidence, including video footage recorded by tourists present at the scene," Judge Ashworth continued. "Your behavior showed a flagrant disregard for British law, a contemptuous attitude toward our military traditions, and a disturbing belief that your financial resources exempted you from the rules that apply to everyone else." In the public gallery, several tourists who had witnessed the previous day's events had come to observe the proceedings. Among them was the